Well, welcome to the second Sunday of our regathering process. We're certainly glad that you are here with us, whether you're worshiping with us on site or online. We're glad that you joined us. I did hear last week that actually our first part of the regathering process, first Sunday back in the building, went very well, and so we appreciate your helping with us and your cooperation. I do understand that online some people got a solo through my microphone. I think the online attendance dropped about 90% right after that part occurred. But we want you to take your Bibles or find a Bible app and go to John chapter 12 this morning. John chapter 12. We're continuing the series, Connecting to Jesus, and today's message is Connecting to Jesus When People Question You. Dan Squire's friends and family gathered at a Toronto funeral home to say goodbye to the retired welder. But while the funeral service was in progress, Dane Squires showed up at his sister's house. A few blocks away, mourners stood over a closed casket speaking fondly of Dane's life and their memories of him. Dane's sister, Diana, was too distraught to attend the funeral, and so she stayed home. But when she peered out her front door after hearing a knock on it, she thought it was a ghost. Diana opened the door, and her brother, who was thought to be dead, entered and said, "Dane, everyone is at your funeral right now." An individual that had been hit by a commuter train in the city was incorrectly identified as Dane Squires. Once Diana explained what had happened, he wanted to jump in a taxi and go attend his own funeral. His sister said he even wanted to sign his own guest book at the service. But instead, she talked him into staying at the house, and they phoned the funeral home, and the service was interrupted with the news, Mr. Squires is on the phone. His daughter that was attending, Trina, screamed and said, "What is going on here?" The attending priest calmed her by saying, "There's been a mistake, but it's a really good mistake." So the family ended the funeral service and started towards Diana's home. When asked about what he did then, Dane Squires responded, "I just stayed at the house, waited on the rest of my family to return. I helped my sister to prepare the meal. If I'm the guest of honor at the party, I might as well help with it." The headlines throughout Toronto read, "Man phones his own funeral." Can you imagine being at the funeral service for someone and the person that's supposed to be deceased suddenly calls the funeral home, or they suddenly walk in and appear? Well, the reality is all of us would like to be able to say there was a mistake made and the person for whom we are grieving is indeed still alive. I've done hundreds of funerals, and there have been many times I have thought, I wish this weren't happening to the family. I've so badly wanted to go up to the casket and say, "Get up. Show your family you're still alive." Three men were talking about what might be said about each of them at their own funerals. The first one said, "I hope I'm remembered as a hardworking and honest individual." The second one said, "I hope it is said about me that I love my family and I would do anything for them." The third one said, "I hope it's said about me, look, he's moving." Well, the story we're going to study today is an encounter with a previously deceased person. Lazarus had just been raised from the dead after his body had been placed in the tomb for 4 days. And there is a heightened sense of excitement and expectation. It is not often that you attend a funeral and then return back to the house to see the deceased walking around. But I want us to see in John chapter 12 this story, this celebration of a man who had been raised from the dead. John 12, beginning at verse 1. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Now, you probably remember the story. Lazarus had been ill. Jesus often spent time in the town of Bethany with Lazarus and his two sisters, Mary and Martha. Most Bible scholars think this home of this brother and his two sisters was a retreat place where Jesus could get away and he could relax and get away from some of the crowds and the demands. But we're not told in John chapter 11 what the cause of Lazarus' death was. But he grew sicker and sicker until one day he died. Now, Jesus was called to the scene before Lazarus died, but he delayed his arrival by 2 days, and the messenger that was sent to retrieve Jesus took 2 days to find him and get back. So when Jesus gets back to the house of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, Lazarus has been deceased for 4 days. Now, at that time in the Jewish thought process, the belief was a person could be deceased up to 3 days, and possibly the soul and the body might reunite. But for there to be a resuscitation or a resurrection of the body 4 days or beyond was considered an absolute impossibility. But no one there had really witnessed a resurrection anyway. But that belief extended to the 4th day. The soul was completely away from the body, and there would be no reunion. I think Jesus deliberately delayed going to Lazarus 2 days and then taking the 2-day trip just to dispel this myth. Now, we know in John 11 that Jesus said, this has happened so that the glory of God might be revealed. But in the story in John 12, we're going to see a couple of contrasts of two perspectives. One that is worldly and one that is eternal. And these two perspectives often collide even today. And we're going to see they certainly did in the first century. Because while one person connected to Jesus, another questioned what is occurring. Look again with me in John 12, beginning at verse 2, at the celebration that is occurring. Here, a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served while Lazarus was among those reclining at the table with him. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus are throwing a dinner party for Jesus. They thought he had deserved it since he had just raised Lazarus from the dead. It was a time to celebrate. Can you imagine some of the dinner conversations with Lazarus? What would you ask Lazarus if you had opportunity to speak to him? I mean, would you ask the question, does dying hurt? Woody Allen said, I don't mind dying, I just won't want to be around when it happens. What is it like in the grave? Are you aware of anything? Were you glad to be brought back to this world, or would you have preferred to stay where you were? What did it feel like when your soul re-entered your body? Now, Lazarus did not spend 90 minutes in heaven. Rather, he spent 4 days in the grave. And he's now enjoying time with family and friends. Now, this account is given also for us in Mark chapter 14. And it says there this meal took place in the home of Simon the leper. Jesus healed him, and he was the one probably hosting the party. So you have at least 2 people at this party, at this celebration, who've experienced miraculous recoveries. But during the meal, or probably at the end of the meal, Mary sits next to the feet of Jesus. Now, this isn't the first time she's done this. A few months earlier, Jesus was visiting in the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. And while Martha was busy preparing a meal, Mary sat and listened to Jesus. And Jesus, on that occasion, indicated that Mary had chosen what is better. But this celebration here is about to go to another level. As Mary is sitting and listening to Jesus, Lazarus, Simon, and Judas, and they're all having these conversations, an idea suddenly struck her. The tension about Jesus was quickly rising from the Jewish opposition. His death was drawing very near. And then suddenly Mary remembered a valuable family possession, a flask of expensive perfume called nard. Now, later on in the story, we're told this perfume was worth a whole year's wages. That is an expensive bottle of perfume. When I was changing flights on my way back from Israel, and we had a layover in Paris, I bought Barb some dark French chocolate because she loves chocolate, and I do too. And it was a very small box of dark French chocolate, but it was very expensive. And I remembered thinking, I could have bought dozens of Dove chocolates for the same amount if I just wait till I got back to the United States. But I wanted to have some from Paris. The average annual salary in the Columbus area is $64,500. Can you imagine spending $64,500 on one pint of perfume? Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were probably very wealthy people. We know from a few other stories in the Bible that they shared their wealth with Jesus in helping to provide for him an occasional place to rest, and they provided meals for his travels. I wonder if this might have been the second flask of nard that Mary owned, and that she used the first one on her brother Lazarus when he died, because nard was often used for burials to help cover the stench of the decaying body. Mary was so overcome by her love for Jesus that she impulsively and creatively used this very expensive perfume to express her love for Jesus while he was still alive. Now you need to understand something. This act of worship that Mary is performing, it is leaving all cultural boundaries. Because in that day, respectable Jewish women never let down their hair in public, nor would they ever sit at the dinner table with men. This was a very special moment for her, and she knew it's probably never going to be repeated. And then suddenly, all the guests in the house began to smell this fragrance of the perfume as it begins wafting throughout the atmosphere. All the senses in that moment were being used to worship Jesus. Mary could see Jesus sitting there. She could touch Jesus' feet with her hair. She could hear the conversation among Jesus and the others gathered. She could smell the fragrance. She could probably even taste the perfume in the air. If you've ever walked through a mall and into a store that carries lots of perfumes and colognes, you've probably walked through that area and you literally taste the perfume, don't you? As you're going through that area, you can taste it as you walk through there. And I think that's exactly what the aroma was in that house suddenly in that moment. Liz Curtis Higgs, in her book, The Women of Easter, writes, "The last thing we would do with something so valuable is pour it onto a man's feet, but we're not Mary. Ounce after ounce drenched his skin, soaked the hem of his garment, pulled on the floor around his heels. Friends, it was scandalous, and it was glorious." I think the aroma caught the attention of all the guests because they usually smelled it at a graveside service. But at this dinner party, the celebration was enhanced by Mary's demonstration of love. Matt and Tiffany Wilson of our church got engaged at a circus. Matt arranged to propose to his future bride in one of the circus rings. They had a clown involved. There was the big spotlight, and the clown swept down the spotlight where it was large to a small spotlight, and then the spotlight is suddenly on him stepping out of the stands, and he gets down and proposes to her in front of a circus crowd and in front of a whole bunch of clowns. No wonder their life has been kind of clowny all ever since. At their wedding reception, they left here to go from here where their wedding was held to the reception in a helicopter. And so it was really unique, both the proposal, the wedding, and everything. And I, as a preacher, had to take advantage of that. And so in their wedding ceremony, I said, I'm going to talk about the 3 rings of marriage. There's 3 rings of a circus. I'm talking about the 3 rings of marriage. And so we talked about the engagement ring, the wedding ring, and guess what the third one is? The suffering that occurs in marriage. And they let me get by with it. I thought, if you could propose to her at a circus, I can make a circus out of your wedding. And so we did. But celebrations can cause creative measures to be taken to enhance the special occasion. When all the graduation ceremonies were canceled due to COVID-19, I thought it was pretty unique when Southwest Licking Schools had buses deliver the diplomas to each home of the graduating seniors. And so Barb and I were able to attend 2 of those on the Saturday they did that, and we were impressed, and the atmosphere was exciting, and it was still a great celebration of the graduates' accomplishments. Of course, it wasn't what we're used to in a traditional graduation ceremony, but it still was a moment of celebration to celebrate for these seniors the milestone which they were achieving. But here in John 12, it was such a heartwarming demonstration of love that it would have been a good place to stop in the story. But it didn't stop there. Judas Iscariot, who was going to later betray Jesus, objected. And so we go from a celebration to a criticism. As Mary was connecting to Jesus in this very intimate moment and this very generous of expression of love for him, her actions were immediately questioned. Look at verse 4 of John 12. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. You know, criticism can take the edge off of the finest and the most exciting deed. And this objection by Judas probably made Mary second guess herself. It may have made Jesus look like an egotist for even accepting the gift in the minds of a lot of other people. But if you've ever poured out your heart to God in some demonstration of love, and then you've had someone criticize you over it, it can hurt deeply. I remember probably a decade ago, I did a baptism here of a man who was an elderly man, but he had lived a very risque lifestyle for a long time, and his sister had come to witness his baptism. And after we had the baptism, as a private baptism, there was about 20, 30 people here. And after he was back in the dressing room getting redressed, we came out here to celebrate with him. And while waiting on him, his sister came over to me and she said, I just hope the baptism took. Because she said it didn't do a thing for me. He nauseates me every time I see him or around him. And right when she said that, her brother just came walking out of that hallway, and he heard every word she said. And he was so disappointed. He had been so excited about his decision to be baptized, but then it was interrupted and tempered with criticism. I felt so sorry for him in that moment that I wanted to baptize his sister for about 20 minutes. Judas's question sounds very noble. But this expression of love for Mary, for Jesus, became a flashpoint for Judas. He sees this use of this expensive perfume as a total waste of money. But notice in the passage here, we're given commentary by John that Judas is hiding his real motive under the guise of desiring to help the poor. That was not his motive at all. Judas wasn't objecting to Mary's generosity as much as he was trying to justify his own greed. And did you notice, have you ever realized, these are the very first words that were ever spoken by Judas. The very first words in Scripture that are ever recorded by this disciple named Judas are words of criticism. Judas criticized Mary for wasting so much money, but Judas was in no position to actually criticize her. He didn't know what her giving record had been. Maybe she'd already donated 5 flasks of nard to the poor. Right as the COVID-19 pandemic was starting, a family in our church experienced a significant loss in their home due to flooding. And already several families here in the church had contacted me that they'd be willing to assist others if there was a need. And with the approval of our elders, I sent out an email to 23 families, and the response of generosity was overwhelming. Now, I do not know individuals giving within our church. I think that'd probably skew my perspective of some. I've been in ministry long enough and have dealt with church people long enough to know that there are people who are very generous givers, and they may do so even on limited incomes. And there are people who may have very significant incomes who maybe have never even given to the Lord's work, or have given so little that it would be an embarrassment if somebody actually knew their giving. I have a preacher friend who says, it's good that most preachers don't know individual giving of those in their congregations because we'd either hug them or slug them. And here's what was about to happen. Judas was about ready to slug Mary. But as he accused her of wasting resources, he's wanting them for the wrong motive. You see, while hers was a very generous act, his was a very selfish act. And remember, Judas will betray Jesus for less money than what this perfume is worth. Judas had already disregarded Jesus of being worthy of such an act of worship. While Judas's logic was compelling, his motives were totally self-centered. And the difference between Mary and Judas in this story is quite stunning. She's from a small town in Judea. She is not supposed to understand Jesus, but she did. She had some resources, and she's willing to use them to express her love for him. Judas was a well-connected apostle. He was to have supported Jesus, but he didn't. And Judas wanted resources not to express love for Jesus, but to get his hands on them and to be selfish. Mary based her gift on worship, while Judas based it on worth. And there are going to be times when your faith is criticized, and when your faith in Jesus Christ gets questioned. Is your faith worth what you are doing? You serve. Is it worth your time? Is it worth your financial investment? Is your faith worth maybe needing to leave some friends behind because of their poor choices? Had Mary sold the expensive perfume and given the money to the poor, that would have been very noble. But here's the reality. It would have not lessened the plight of the poor on this earth today. You see, on the scale of eternity, the extravagant action Mary took became the most economical one. And here's what's amazing about this story. Jesus accepted this gift of extravagance. He did not condemn Mary's act of love. Look at verses 7 and 8. "Leave her alone," Jesus replied. It was intended that she should have saved this perfume for the day of my burial. You'll always have the poor among you, but you'll not always have me." So I noticed that Jesus gently commended Mary, but then he also did not directly condemn Judas. Jesus already knew what was in Judas's heart. Jesus could have easily ripped into Judas. "You conniving thief. How dare you wound the heart of this woman over a pure motive when your heart's already so greedy?" No, instead Jesus said to Judas, "Leave her alone. She did it to prepare my body for burial." You see, when Jesus died, it was so close to the Sabbath, no one would have time to anoint his body. Mary's doing it here ahead of time. Being a follower of Jesus Christ can elicit criticism. And here is why. There is a contrast. In this story, there is a contrast of the earthly and the eternal. Judas is seeing the scenario from one perspective and Mary from another. This is really the point in the story where I wish more were included in other Bible stories. What did Lazarus think of this? He's the one in the room who'd been dead for 4 days and then brought back to life. If anyone had a different perspective about this world, it should have been him. He should have had a different perspective because he'd been already to eternity and back. He could easily contrast it with his earthly experience. Why didn't Lazarus stand up and say, "Judas, you are wrong. What Mary is doing is more beneficial than what you want to do with that nard for the poor. There's going to be eternal rewards for her and for others because of her generosity today." Maybe you remember the story that Jesus told, some considered a parable, out of Luke chapter 16. A man who led a very wealthy life on earth, but he did nothing to prepare for eternity. And the man went to hell in eternity, and he was in agony. And while there, he wanted to have opportunity to return to the earth and warn his 5 brothers so that they would not experience the same fate. Judas focused on the earthly use alone of the nard, while Mary focused on the eternal benefit of her gift. I struggle sometimes with Christians who get a lot of earthly rewards, but then they rarely show much investment of their lives into eternal matters. And I think it's because I can so easily be impressed with the kind of rewards that people receive on this earth. The volume of rewards and the noise of the fanfare and the numbers of them, and whether it be just awards or money or accolades, it's so easy for me to forget that God's eye is always on motive, authenticity, truth, the eternal benefit. God's rewards are based on faithfulness and the quality of our faith. Oh, there's 2 lessons I want you to take home today. 2 lessons to remind us each of what faith can mean when people question our choices about Jesus Christ. Here's the first one. Recognize that an expression of faith in Jesus Christ may seem to some illogical. Recognize that an expression of faith in Jesus Christ may seem to some illogical. Mary's expression of faith was questioned because in the scheme of an earthly perspective, it seemed illogical to waste a whole year's income on one person when hundreds who were poor could have been given provisions. Judas looked at the practical use of this gift, but in the economy of Jesus, it was totally upside down. Because Jesus is always more concerned about our eternal well-being and our eternal investments into the future than just our immediate needs being met. Now, it isn't that God does not care about our immediate needs, but we sometimes get into making sure immediate needs are being met and yet avoid or just misplace the priority of eternal needs. And we are seeing in the church today a lot more emphasis on benevolence and doing good deeds for people and organizations, and that is good, because the church should be doing more for humanity. But on the flip side, I'm hearing less and less church-wise about winning souls and evangelism and getting people headed to the right place for eternity. We live in a society that does not want to hear much about that because we don't want to offend anyone. And for us to even suggest that someone could spend eternity in hell is not considered very kind. But if as the church we say very little about one's eternal destination and their existence in eternity, and we only focus on provisions here in this world, we have done the greatest disservice possible if they go into eternity and they miss knowing Jesus. Mary lost some of our resources, but she had life. Judas wanted more resources, but he lost life. Mary lost herself in Jesus, knowing he alone is the one who is eternal. Judas lost his Savior because he was more worried about himself. Judas would have certainly fit well in today's culture of me. Faith demands that we worship Jesus Christ and that we become less concerned about what we're getting out of church and that we become more concerned about what we're putting into it. And so a life of faith demands that our egocentric attitudes get challenged. See, Judas's pragmatism was good for a prudent investor, but it was horrible for the kingdom of God and its eternal outlook. There's a great little book out entitled The End of Me. The End of Me is written by Kyle Idleman, and in that book, he has a letter that he writes to himself, to me, and it goes this way. Dear me, I've known you for as long as I can remember. Looking back, it is fair to say I've treated you pretty well. I have put you ahead of anything and everything else. Agreed? I love you, me, but I can't keep living for you. You always insisted that if I just keep you happy, then I'd be happy. As simple as that. But you know what? It's not as simple as that. It never has been. Me, I've let you be in control and sit in the driver's seat. But it's clear you can't be trusted. You keep insisting you know the way we should go, but it always seems to be a dead end. I've looked into some other options, and I've decided to begin a journey down a different path. It's narrow and difficult, and not many choose it, but it leads to the real and abundant life. However, and there is no easy way to say this, I can't take this path if I bring you along. So me, this is the end of you. Sincerely, me. And sometimes we need to get to the end of me. Mary and Judas both claimed to worship Christ. And they claimed to worship the same Christ. But their perspectives were completely different. Two different perspectives, headed down two different paths, opposite of one another. And the two philosophies still exist today in the world and in the church. What's been your latest expression of worship for Jesus Christ? Mary was willing to take something that was very valuable to express her love for the Lord. And when you do that, people will question you. They'll inquire about your lifestyle, your avoidance of certain events, your giving of money to a missionary. Recognize that an expression of faith in Jesus Christ may seem illogical. Here's the second lesson to take home, and it is this. Remember that an example of faith in Jesus Christ is always going to leave an aroma. Remember that an example of Jesus Christ, of faith in Jesus Christ, is always going to leave an aroma. As Mary poured that perfume on the feet of Jesus, all those in there would have immediately begun smelling that nard. Any of you got a scented oil diffuser at home? Any of you use those? It puts the oil into the air. A couple of Christmases ago, a family here in the church bought one for Barb and I, especially during the winter months when you're in the inside a lot more. It's nice to put the lavender oil in there and let it go throughout the house and turn it on. The one we have is not a heated oil thing. It is one that disperses it by vibration. And where we have it sitting is right next to my chair in the living room. And so I can sit there watching TV, and I start to smell that lavender being diffused throughout the air, and I mean, 3 minutes, I'm gone. I am snoring. Of course, it wouldn't have to be there. I'd be falling asleep snoring anyway. And I just start really getting relaxed, and I can smell that lavender permeating the air. When you're setting an example of faith, there are going to be some who question you, wanting to know what is different about your life, because your faith leaves an aroma, figuratively speaking. But knowing faith leaves an aroma. I know for me, I've sometimes wondered, does my faith rise as a stench in the nostrils of God? And I think as the aroma began to fill the room, suddenly there's some self-evaluations occurring. Just a few days before Jesus' death, some of the disciples would hide. Peter in a few days would deny he even knew Jesus. Judas hid his own faith, but he had enough boldness to indicate he was really concerned about the poor, even though he wasn't. What's your motive for following Jesus? What aroma do you leave about the Lord with the life you're living? 2 Corinthians 2, beginning at verse 14, says, "But thanks be to God, who always leads us as captives in Christ's triumphal procession and uses us to spread the aroma of Him, of the knowledge of Him everywhere. For we are to God the pleasing aroma of Christ among those who are being saved and those who are perishing. To the one we are an aroma that brings death, to the other an aroma that brings life. And who is equal to such a task?" Mary left an aroma of faith and generosity. What about your aroma of faith? When Paul writes about the triumphal procession, he's referring to the parades in the Roman world that would occur after a victory in battle for the military. Incense would be carried along the parade route. Now, to the victorious army, that aroma of the incense was one of victory. To the defeated army, the aroma of incense was the stench of death. And Mary's release of that perfume for her and to Jesus was a smell of life. But for others in that room, it became a stench because it called their own motives into question. Oh, the aroma of your faith is the influence you have. It's your testimony for Jesus Christ. For some who will see your example, they enjoy the aroma. For others, it might be nauseating. And that's because there's two perspectives for which we can live. We live for God, or we live for self. And you never know how your influence may be spreading. Mary may have been criticized for what she did in making the right choice for her perspective on eternity. But she made the choice, and she worshiped her Lord instead. I've been trying to do some extra reading during this COVID-19 pandemic. I've had a little bit of extra time over the last 3 or 4 months. And one of the books that I read several weeks ago was April 1865, The Month That Saved America. Jay Winnick writes about how Abraham Lincoln knew his purpose for being the president during the Civil War. Now, Lincoln was heavily criticized for many of his decisions and his actions. Lincoln's own Secretary of War, William Stanton, called him the original baboon. The public criticized him as being a third-rate lawyer. They considered him to be very clumsy. They sometimes called him a giraffe because he was 6'4". They called him the presidential hick because he was born in Kentucky. Hold the comments. But at the end of Lincoln's life, his influence was recognized and praised. William Stanton, who had called him the original baboon, in tears then said, "There lies the greatest leader of men the world has ever seen." Winnick relates in his book how Lincoln persevered through all that criticism. You see, Lincoln saw himself as being led by the providence of God to be an example for the American people. Winnick concludes his book, "Lincoln felt not the familiar drumbeat of ambition, nor of political satisfaction, but of destiny. And when that happened, he was a rock." I think that was Mary in this story. She became the rock. She knew her purpose. She knew her testimony. She knew her influence could focus the attention of others to Jesus. She just needed a way to do that. And then she thought of it. There was this flask of expensive nard sitting on a shelf. She would get it, pour it over Jesus' feet, and those in the room would immediately turn towards him. She became a rock then, and then she could endure the criticism given to her by Judas. When your goal in life becomes to pour out your devotion totally to Christ, regardless of what people think or may feel or question you about, you then become that rock. 1 Corinthians 15:58 says, "Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, stand firm. Let nothing move you. Always give yourselves fully to the work of the Lord, because you know that your labor in the Lord is not in vain." And so your expressions of faith to Christ and your example of faith could help determine someone's eternal destiny, because you were willing to connect to Jesus when there were others who questioned you.